In this video, we have another Apple-inspired project, this time the image carousel found on the Apple Vision Pro product page, as you can see here on the Apple website. If you want to see other Apple-inspired project tutorials, I'll drop a link to a playlist on screen and also in the description down below. So here's a quick demo of what we are going to build for this image carousel. So you can see here, we can see one image at a time, and we have the next image faded out next to it. Once I hover over the image, the left and right controls become available, which I can click to go through the list. And there is another list of controls here in this pill at the bottom, which I can use to go to any specific image in the list. To get started, go ahead and download the starter code using the link in the description down below. Make sure to run npm install to get all the dependencies. And with that, let's jump in. Here we have the starter code for the project. It's just a blank one-page website built using Next.js and styled with Tailwind. Two things to call out in the starter code before we get started. The first is all of the media assets required. So the images, some of the SVGs for the icons we're going to use are all in the public folder already in the starter code. And the second is I've already gone ahead and added a SVG loader in the next config file here. And this will allow us to treat SVGs just like React components and just make it much easier to work with them. With that, let's start by laying out the images horizontally in a row. So I'm going to start by going into this main tag, removing this placeholder content, and we'll add a few styles to start with here. I'm going to give this a display flex, flex column, item center, and justify between, minimum height of the screen, and we'll give a padding of 24. This is just to set up the bounds of the overall carousel and center it properly on the screen. Now, inside of this main tag, we are going to drop a div, and this div, I'm going to give it a position of relative, full width, a max width of 1500 pixels, give it display flex, and items center. We're going to use this div to lay out all the different components we're going to work with. So the list of images and also all the controls. And so some of this is just to set up the positioning for all of those different components inside this div. Now we'll create another div, and this will be where we will hold all of the images. So I'm going to give this a couple of class names, a display flex horizontally, a gap of 4, which will give a gap of 16 pixels between the children, which will be the images. And we'll also say flex no wrap. So this will make sure that as the children of this div, the images, get laid out on screen, they won't get wrapped to the next row. And so they'll all sit in one single row and will be allowed to go off screen, which is the intended behavior we're going for. So then inside this div, we will want to put all the images in here. Now, before I do that, and to help with this, I'm going to go to the top and I'm going to create an array of the URLs for the images. So images will be image1.jpg, image2.jpg, and image3.jpg. And then inside this div, we'll go in here and I will map over this images array, images.map. We'll take the actual image URL and the index. And then for each of these, I will map to a image tag. I will give a couple of attributes here. So the key will be just the index. The source will be the image. Alt will be image. And I'll also give some class names here. I will give it an object cover so that it properly scales up and fills the space available and doesn't look distorted. And to size this, I will give it a aspect ratio of 16:9, which will give it a nice widescreen aspect ratio. So if I hit save, all right, so now we have the images up. You can see they're in a row. They haven't been wrapped because of this flex no wrap, so they're going off screen. One thing to keep in mind going forward is this div, where we're defining width full and max width of 1500 pixels, is defining the bounding box of this first image. That's what it's doing right now. And so if we were to quickly try to scale this, we'll see that right there, the images stop increasing in size because it hits this max width of 1500. But that's what this div is doing, is defining that size. All right, so with that, we have the images laid out. So let's start to add some controls so we can actually move through these images one at a time. So the first thing that we'll want to do is be able to track what is the current image that is on screen. And so for that, I'm going to create a new state that we can track. We'll call it current, and we'll use state, which will initially set to 0. So this state variable will track the index of the active image in this images array. So at the beginning, when we load, it will just be the first image at index 0. And then as we move through the images, we will update the state to show the correct image. So how will we actually move left and right? Well, we will just increment or decrement this current variable. So let's go ahead and quickly set up some helper functions for that. So I'm going to create one called onPreviousClick, which will be when we click the left button, and we'll say if current is greater than 0, then set current to current -1. If current is equal to 0, then we're in the first image. So if you click left, you shouldn't be able to do that because you're already at the first image. And similarly, we will create a onNextClick. And here I will track if current is less than images.length -1. So just making sure we're not at the very end of the list. Then we'll set current to current +1. So now that we've set those up, let's actually figure out how to attach them to some buttons. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just show the controls on the screen, and then we'll connect up the logic. Above this div where we have the images, I'm going to create another div. And this div, I'm going to do some styling here for the arrows on the left and the right. I'm going to do a position of absolute, left to right to flexbox, justify between, and a Z of 20. And so what this is doing is saying position absolute, so you can position this div anywhere within this parent div. Left to right to will mean that the bounds of this div are a little bit positioned off the left edge and a little bit off the right edge, so filling up most of this space in between. And flex and justify between, because we're going to have the two buttons on either side in a second. And then this Z10 makes sure that this div just sits on top of the set of images. So then inside this div, we're going to put the two buttons. So I will have a button class, and inside this button class, I will put the actual SVGs that we're going for here. And because we have the SVG loader already set up, we can just import these like React components. So I'll say import left from, and then we just find the SVG file. And I will also quickly do this for the right SVG as well. Now that that's done, I'll come down here back to this button, and I'll simply call left like this. And if I hit save, you'll see that the left arrow shows up. And similarly, let's just make another button and put right instead, and the right button shows up as well. Let's do a little bit of styling on these. The main thing I want to do is update the size. So I'm going to do a class name, height 8, width 8, and I will copy this as well to the other arrow. So make them a little bit bigger and easier to find and to actually click. And then finally, let me attach the on clicks to these buttons. So for this left one, I'll attach on previous click, and on the right button, on next click. So if I hit save and click these buttons, you can see we can hover over them. But if I click them, nothing's going to happen. And that's because this state variable is being updated in the background, but we're not currently using it to update how we're showing the images at all. So let's go ahead and do that. So for this, we're actually going to go ahead and introduce Framer Motion, which we'll use to nicely animate the shift between the different images. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to this div and add some Framer Motion properties to it. Effectively, the idea is going to be we have this div, which includes all the images, including the ones off screen. And so based on the value of current, we will just shift that div to the left or to the right based on which image should be showing on screen at any given time. So the first thing I'm going to do is make this a motion div. And inside of this div, I'm going to pass in some Framer Motion properties. So The main one I want to pass in is animate. And this animate property, I will set the X value, the horizontal positioning, and I'll use backticks to put a dynamic string in, and I'm going to put in calc of minus current times 100% minus current rem. Now, what this is doing is it's going to set the horizontal positioning of this big div based on the value of current. So I think this current times 100% should hopefully make sense. So every time you shift over by one image, you are shifting over by essentially 100% of the size of this div that's on screen. This current rem is for managing the gap between the images. So that's why this is added to the calculations as well, so that the next image is also properly centered on screen. So if I hit save, and now if we try to click the buttons, look at that. We have the images shifting around as we would expect. I'm not a big fan of this default animation, so let's go ahead and update that. And what I'm going to do here actually is, because I'm going to try to apply similar animation settings to multiple different animations we'll get to in a second, I'm going to surround most of the content here in a motion config tag. And so this allows us to, in one place, set configurations for animations, and it will apply those to all the children automatically. So what I'm going to set here is the transition property, and we'll say duration should be 0.7. And for the ease, I will pass in this array to define the animation curve. And we'll make sure to add the closing tag as well. And so now if we try doing this animation, you can see it's a much softer animation, which I think works better here for the carousel. Now, another quick animation we're going to add is for the opacity of all of the non-active images. You might remember from the Apple page that the images that were not the primary one at any given time were faded out. So we're going to apply that as well. For that, we need to convert this image tag to be a motion image. And then inside of this, I'm going to add an animate property. And here I'm going to say, set the opacity value. So if the index of this image is equal to the current active one, then opacity should be 1. Otherwise, I'll set it to be 0.3. And because it's set as an animation property, the opacities will properly fade as well as we shift between images. So if I hit save, you can already see like this image is faded out. And so now if I switch images, the opacity is also properly animating as we're shifting between the images. Now, the one thing that we still need to tackle, which is a little bit of a small detail, is we want these controls to only be visible when we're hovering over the image, and otherwise they should be hidden away. Now, to do this, we are going to make use of the onHoverStart and onHoverEnd properties that are available for these elements. So primarily what we want to do is when we are hovering over this div, which is again defining this image, we want the controls that we defined up here to be showing, and otherwise we don't want them to be showing. So for this, I'm going to create another state variable, and I'm going to call it isFocus, and then set isFocus. And by default, I'm going to set it equal to false. And so when isFocus is true, we will display the arrows, otherwise they won't be displayed. So let's first start by figuring out how we want to set these. And so on this div below this animate property, I will add the onHoverStart. And here will be just a function. So once the hover starts, I'm going to say set isFocus to be true. And then there's also onHoverEnd. And here we're going to set isFocus to be false. So this won't change anything right now because we're not using isFocus in any way. So let's do that. So we're going to go to this div here, which contains the arrows. And I'm going to start a surrounding JavaScript and say if isFocus is true, only then will we show this div here. I hit save. You can see immediately, because isFocus is originally false, we don't see the arrows, but you can see if I just hover over the image, then it will show. Now let's make this a little bit cleaner. We're going to convert this div to be a motion div, so we can do some Framer Motion animations on it. And then inside of this div, I'm going to apply some Framer Motion properties. So we'll set initial to be opacity of 0, animate to be opacity of 1, and exit to be opacity of 0. So of course, this is saying originally, before this div is loaded, the opacity will be 0. Once this div is added to the DOM, we want to animate it to a state where the opacity is 1, so it will fade in. And then once this div is removed from the DOM, we want to animate it out such that opacity is 0, or it will fade out. So now if I hover, you can see it nicely fades in. If I hover out, though, you'll see that it just disappears instantly. It doesn't seem like the exit animation is activating. And that is because, by default, Framer Motion does not listen for the DOM removal of an element, and therefore, to trigger the exit animations, you need to explicitly tell Framer Motion to do that. And we do that by surrounding all of this in an animate presence tag. So I'm just going to surround all of this in animate presence. And just like that, if I try again, if I hover, they fade in. And if I move the cursor out, they nicely fade out. Now, there is a small detail here which we need to fix, which is if I hover over the image, it fades in. That's great. But this div that is surrounding the buttons is actually this box. And so you actually will see that when I get to the middle, I now am hovering not over the image technically, but over the control box. And so this hover end is actually being triggered, which is why set focus is being set to false and the controls are being hidden. So just to fix this, what we're going to do is just copy this on hover start and end functionality and add it as well to this surrounding div for the controls so that we know even when we hover in the middle of the image, you'll see that the controls are still there and they still work. Now, the final piece we're going to work on is adding the secondary controls for this image carousel in the form of the pill at the bottom with the dots, which we can use to select a specific image to jump to. So for this, I'm going to add it to the bottom of our file below this motion div. And so here, I'm just going to use a div and I'm going to position it absolute because we need to position it on top of the image, bottom of 10. So stick it near the bottom, and we need to center it horizontally. So for that, I'm going to use the classic CSS trick of setting the left to 50%, do a transform, and do a negative translate x of 50%. And also going to set a z to 10 so that this div sits on top of everything else. So that will position our div appropriately. So now let's actually make the pill. So for this, I'm going to do another div. For this div, I'm going to give it a display flex, gap of 3. This is for positioning the dots that we're going to place in a second. Padding x of 3, padding y of 2, background of gray 400, a rounded full. So we give that pill shape in a second, and opacity of 80. So if I hit save, there we go. We start to see the beginnings of the pill shape. Pretty small right now because we don't have any dots, so that will change in a second, but you can see it's positioned where we want it. And then inside of this div, we need to place the dots that will represent each of the images. So for this, I'm going to map over the images array. We don't actually care about, in this case, the values in the images array, but we just care about the index more so. And for each of these, we're going to map a button. This button will have a key of index. On click, well, when we click a specific button at an index, we need to jump to that image. So we'll just pass a function directly and say set current to be index. And then inside this button, to visually show it as a dot, I'm going to do that using a div, and I'm going to give it some class names. So we're going to give it we're going to give it a dynamic class name here. So we're going to do a width 2, height 2, rounded full. So if I save this, you'll see these will give a bunch of circles, which we can't see right now because of the color. But if I give it right now a BG white, you'll see 3 dots here. But this color we actually want to dynamically set based on which image is currently showing. So we will say if index is equal to current, then we can show BG white. Else we'll use zinc 600. And there you see now, we just have the first dot, which is white, and then the other 2 are the dark gray. And now if I can click on, let's say, the third one, it will set the value of current to be the last image, and it will animate properly. Because these animations are tied to the value of current, it will animate very smoothly to that image, and it won't just jump. With that, we have finished building this animated image carousel. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments below. Also, if there are any other topics you want to see covered on the channel, let me know in the comments as well. And on screen now, you'll find a link to another great tutorial for you to check out next, and I'll see you in the next video.